intersections of identity too. Um, Hopefully, I think we should have all of our panelists. I'm just double checking. We do.
They're all here.
Shiv?
We are. Yeah.
Perfect, perfect, great. So yeah, but without, I mean, I think we should be able to start on time. We have a packed panel today of fascinating, exciting speakers who are talking about a vast array of topics that also interlink to with each other quite beautifully. So I'll just start off with brief introductions to first of all myself. In case anyone doesn't know here, I'm Zehra Kazmi. I'm one of the co-founders of the Sabr Collective and a PhD candidate working on memory and nostalgia and South Asian Muslim writing at the University of St. Andrews. Um, uh, the panelists that we have today, and we are extremely excited to have such a fantastic panel with us today. Starting off today with one of our featured speakers, Professor Khanum Sheikh, who is an associate professor of gender and women's studies at California State University, Northridge, where she also serves as director of Middle East and Islamic Studies and is co-director of the cross-campus interdisciplinary civil discourse and social change initiative. She has held fellowships at UC Santa Barbara and San Francisco State University. Her research interests include transnational feminist theories, Islam, gender and religious agency, race and racialization of North American Muslims. She has published in Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, Feminist Formations, Feminist Studies, among other great journals. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Sheikh. We also have with us Dr. Sreejata Paul, who is an assistant professor of English at Shiv Nadar University in Noida, in India. Prior to this, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay and holds a dual badge PhD degree from IIT Bombay and Monash University, Melbourne. Her research focuses on the intellectual life force trajectories and networks of Muslim women from the Indian subcontinent in the late colonial era. Articles are forthcoming in Hypatia, a Journal of Feminist Philosophy, and Women, a Cultural Review. After that, we have with us Fizza Joffrey, who is a doctoral student at the Faculty of Religion and Theology at Oxford and is studying the intersection of religion, politics, and culture in Pakistan. Then we have with us Pranay Sood, who teaches English at Shaheed Bhagat Singh College in Delhi University. He has earned master's and MPhil degrees from DU. His research interests include representation of religious minorities in literature, literature and memory, translation studies, and men's studies. Then we have with us finally our last speaker for this panel, Professor Afroz Taj, who has studied at Aligarh Muslim University and Jawaharlal Nehru University and is currently associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Taj's research interests include South Asian theatre, cinema, and popular culture. He's the author of The Court of Indar and the Rebirth of North Indian Drama and many published ghazals, geet, dohe, and short stories. His current book project concerns Parsi theatre and the Urdu magazine Shama. So thank you so much, all of us, for joining, for all of you for joining us today. I'm happy to sort of before we start off, just a little bit of sort of just an idea, rough idea of how the panel will go. We are going to have 15 minutes per for Fizza, Sreejata, Pranay, and Professor Taj. And our featured speaker, that is Professor Khanum Sheikh, will have anything between 20 to 30 minutes for her presentation. The rest of you will have to keep it under 15 minutes. And we will have a Q&A, a joint Q&A at the end of the panel. But attendees are welcome to keep posting questions in the chat, or otherwise they can just raise their hands and we can ask questions. Again, please mute yourselves unless you're speaking. We are probably ready to get started whenever you're ready, Professor Sheikh. So if you'd like to go ahead.
I'm ready, Zehra. Do you have the presentation I emailed you?
Yes, I do. So would you like me to screen share, or would you
If
want to
you don't mind, that would be nice.
No, that's fine. Just give, I'm
There's no big rush. There's
also,
no big
and
visuals.
also No, I'm sorry. I should have clarified. Fizza, Joffrey is going to present at the end, so there's a bit of a change in the yeah, in the order. So we have it's Professor Sheikh, then Sreejata, then Pranay, then Professor Taj, and then Fizza right at the end. So yeah, just clarifying this. But yes, just give me one moment and I'll get started with screen sharing. But you can start
Yeah,
speaking if
absolutely.
you'd like.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. This is such a great space. I really woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning, which I don't do yesterday, so that I could listen to all the talks, and I really thoroughly enjoyed them. And most of you organizers are grad students, and I'm so impressed with the beautiful flyer, the organization, and your transnational time organizing. I don't know how you did this to be able to sort of incorporate. So, kudos to you. And I'm so happy to be a part of this space. I've thoroughly enjoyed a lot of the talks so far. Um, I am really excited to share this piece of mine. It's actually a piece that I began many years ago, and it's appearing next month, or I think next in the next issue of Feminist Studies. Um, and when I listened to some of the talks yesterday, oops, yeah, I realized that there was a theme of middle class sharafat that seemed to be popping in some of the conversations. And so I was like, let me pull out some of those moments in my work and also bring those to the fore to sort of show the continuities between some of what we've been talking about. So forgive me, I will be reading. I'm not good at being concise, but I believe it should be close to 25 minutes. Um, this first section is called, my project is called Feminism, Relationality, and Intimate Critique. And the first section in this paper is called The Dupattas Ballu. Khala always warned us about how patriarchy will permeate our lives whether or not we consented to it. Us, the younger generation of girls in my family, often end up in a playful but oppositional banter with her. So that's probably previous slides though. I'll let you know when to switch. Um, Ended up in playful but oppositional banter with her, us arguing that we do not want to spend our lives serving our husbands and their families, and her often using expletives to tell us, to translate literally, how our minds have curdled or damag pit gaye from too much exposure to modern city life. She felt that we had lost our handle on a key fact of life. It is not good for a woman to establish a sense of self that is not attuned to the power-laden contours of her life. That outright refusal to compromise would be the downfall of us girls who pushed back against the conservative ways of our family, often touted as our khandani sharafat, a term that continues to amuse my siblings and I when we consider the salacious activities that have transpired under the guise of sharafat in our khandan. Um, Khala was known for her iron strength, her ability to battle harsh circumstances in life, and for telling the most expressive stories, also for transacting with jinns, actually. Her stories often had to do with the ways of men versus the ways of women, and were often told in Saraiki, a language spoken in southern Punjab, and Urdu intermixed. Once during a visit to Lahore, she bombarded myself and her soon to be married daughter with a litany of advice, which always sounded like a scolding, about marriage and in laws. Don't walk into your in laws' homes demanding what you want, she said. Pehle mahal ko samjho, or understand the environment first, and mold yourself into it. Don't be a woman who demands a chiri ki zaban, which translates to a bird's tongue, meaning something you can't really have, in order to be happy. Watch closely and learn how to work your way into the family. Do not walk into your new home saying, me, me, me. Laughingly, we protested. I asked why we should have to suppress our desires and privilege those of our future husbands and their families. What about us, Khala? What about what we want? She responded forcefully, explaining that the goal was not to dissolve your sense of self, your I, but to tuck it away temporarily while you scan the terrains of power around you. Tie it up in your dupatta's pallu, or the edge of your dupatta or scarf, and let it hang next to your body for a few years. Once you've understood the mahal, or the environment, once you are situated and secure, then untie the knot and let your eyes spread. Only then it can flourish and sustain. I think back often to this story as instructive of the relationship between power, gender, and patriarchy within conservative and newly middle class families like ours, where choices were immensely compressed. Although my siblings and I grew up in a big city, Lahore, we straddled the pull of the more conservative mahols that our parents were raised in. Gender based segregation and strict parda structured our parents' upbringing in smaller cities and towns in southern Punjab, and a plethora of prohibitions had migrated with them into our urban lives and shaped how my siblings and I moved through our lives. We attended all girls schools. We were not allowed to have male friends or even too much interaction with male cousins our age. And at large family gatherings on occasions like Eid, the rooms automatically split up along binarized gendered lines where men gathered on one side and discussed politics and less intimate aspects of life. Women and girls made their way to the other side, checked out each other's outfits, caught up on family and life stories, managed children, and made sure food and chai was served while hot. Our femininities were inculcated, assessed, scrutinized in these collective spaces that relied on our embodied labor of prepping, heating, and serving food, always with different degrees of willingness and skill. We were spatially and symbolically socialized into girlhood through these binarized spaces that were named as our cultural ways. Next slide, Zehra, please. But it was also in these intimate all women spaces that elder women opened up spaces of provocation. Aunties and older cousins shared gendered scripts on how to survive and excel within given scripts of gender, but also on where to push back and how to build our lives as women living in what they recognize too as an unequal world, a sort of choreography of conformity and resistance. Meanwhile, we, the younger generation of women, who were impressed with modern norms of womanhood, romance, fashion, and family, debated with fervor the possibilities of living our lives as modern women. And herein lies the complexity I want to examine. These spaces where the most heteropatriarchal prescriptions of good womanhood were enforced were also the very spaces where we learned to debate, to push back, and to argue over how we could and must navigate expectations structuring our lives. Becoming women was always a process of greater negotiation between generations, one that was not entirely pre given or foreclosed, but whose potentials and possibilities were always being worked out in collective familial spaces that are crucial to the work of cultural reproduction. These all women spaces are intertwined with how I experienced the circumcisions that produce proper women, but also where I learned to critique and to become resistant. What I offer in this paper is an intergenerational theorization of power and resistance within sites of cultural transmission. Next slide, Zara, please. Using kinship as a method allows me to illuminate the contestations within networks of power that bind collectivities within contradictory webs of care and constraint, vulnerability and security, desire and obligation. Such textured narrations reveal the shallow reach of discourses of choice and individual freedom that continue to occupy a central place in feminism. Moreover, these narrations reveal that despite its formidable social function, norms of middle class sharafat are molten. They are inhabited, enforced, fortified, softened, and unmoored at times, always in relation to the shifting materialities of life, and often in the sites meant to reproduce them. Families, in this case, my site is Families and Kinship Networks. Next slide, too, Zehra. Ultimately, I propose a shift in our understanding of resistance as originating from and residing primarily within the freedom seeking individual and her will, and conceptualizing it instead as living within the messy and contradictory crevices of cultural transmissions within which we, as individuals, come into being. Such an exploration can deepen our understanding about how feminist subjects come into being, where feminism originates, and the directionality of its travels. Genealogies that often remain trapped within colonial modes of representation. It also intercepts a presumed linearity that saturates feminist discourses, that of moving from collective oppression to individual empowerment. This section is called Writing Within Resistance. Where we write from inflects both the questions we ask and the conceptual tools we engage in our intellectual work. Here, I'd like to draw on Maria Lugones's idea of writing from within resistance rather than just about it. She writes, under the weight of oppression, quote, that's a quote, with little room to maneuver, I attempt to intervene in the conceptual traps that constituted us as oppressed. End quote. Neither a defensive posture nor one that uncritically replicates colonizing conceptual traps. Lugones' work opens up a crucial space for those of us who write from within these interstices. Writing from within resistance, I offer intimate critique as a framework for exposing normative and regulatory structures of power within which intimacies are produced and sustained as a mode of decoding the workings of power from within. For the facts of gender based oppression cannot occlude the complex and moving cultures and intimacies that produce and at times exceed oppressive norms. Um, Such an approach helps us to think through the relationalities in which subjects are embedded and often invested. It helps track subversive knowledges about power's ability to sustain itself and the techniques of subversion that come precisely from having lived nestled within. This next section is called Choosers and the Choices They Make. I think a lot about the edges where the self is stitched to those who birth, nurture, and sustain our beings. How do we conceptualize this dynamic space, with all its breaking offs and remakings, as a source of insight for articulating feminist and activist subjectivities? Growing up, the rules around gender and appropriate sexuality were very clear. We did not date, we were taught not to believe in romantic love, and we were generally okay with having arranged marriages because that was the norm. If an educated, career oriented, responsible, trustworthy, and Sharif cousin's family sent a marriage proposal for one of my sisters or myself, my parents were quite happy. Marrying within the extended family was more secure, they believed, because a known family or apne was always better than an unknown or ghair family who may have unknown values and expectations that we would have to learn afresh. The elders would have more foresight and leverage if we married within the family, and even today my parents are called upon frequently to resolve marital conflicts and intrafamilial disputes in their role as elders in a large extended family network. More often than not, these interventions include inciting a husband to step into his responsibilities and support his family, mediating issues of marriage, divorce, and inheritance in ways that do not disadvantage girls, facilitating dialogues with in laws who have unreasonable expectations, or chastising a young woman who is not living up to her wifely or motherly duties. Their preference and pressure that we marry a cousin meant that they could continue to have some ability to steer us in the right directions as we navigated terrains over which they had some mastery, and that they would have some purview of and form of protection over our future lives. Of course, it also meant the maintenance of a social world built upon regulatory ideas of gender and family. Freedom in this context was secondary to the security of knowing the flaws and the strengths, the value systems within which prospective husbands were born and raised. Romantic love was considered something filmy. Marriage, instead, was a practical arrangement to navigate with responsibility, sincerity, and commitment, and something that grows into something akin to love. It was in this context that I got engaged to my cousin when I was 21, an engagement that seemed at first feasible and even promising for both individuals and families. But as I continued to access paid work and studies in the US, and as my interactions and experiences grew from living in a diverse city like Los Angeles, I realized that it had become possible for my path to not lead right back to my large extended patriarchal family in Pakistan. I became increasingly involved in social activism and eventually the possibility of pursuing an advanced degree, both of which were sure to be complicated by expectations of marital life. Slowly, I started raising the possibility of postponing and eventually breaking the engagement. In these long negotiations with my parents, I witnessed my father, a kind, strong, hard-working man, who was the only one in his family to ascend in class through formal education, coming close to tears as he tried to convince me of the merits of the engagement, explaining that knowing the groom's family and their strengths and flaws could only benefit me and us in the long run. In his mind, my marrying A cousin could prevent me from the same fate as my eldest sister, who had been married outside of our extended family, moved to the US after marriage, and ended up in a violent, abusive marriage. Stranded in a different country with no family, no friends, no money, and very limited ability to make a living for herself. Her encounter with such marital violence in a far off land where hypothetical freedom resides but was inaccessible to her had torn our family apart. Individual freedom in our context was almost never seen as an absolute ideal to aspire to. Rather, being a lone individual in a far off place without a network to catch a falling person was considered reason for immense grief. In the US, however, none of my life circumstances translated. I remember often being confronted with comments like, but my parents would never push me to marry someone. They would be happy for me as long as I'm happy. Or, how can you marry your cousin? Or, how could you agree to marry a stranger? Or, but it's your life. I remember being a bit dumbfounded, wondering why these translations were bumpy, how and why Americans seemed to have such an enlarged sense of self, why placing a framed picture of a girlfriend or boyfriend on their desk seemed mandatory, and about why the my parents are happy if I am happy logic didn't seem to work in the context of my life. Within what larger systems of meaning does our individual sense of happiness acquire meaning? Where is the self and its sense of happiness delineated from its constitutive ties? Over the years, I have come to recognize that in the context of my growing up, our choices were never assumed to exist in a vacuum, waiting to be made without attachment to larger systems of affinity, sustenance, or social control. Our choices were clearly set up within a terrain paved by unequal access to power, and no one was unaware of that. And these architectures of power and vulnerability, dependency and sustenance were upheld and enforced often by individuals on the margins of power. Indeed, feminist scholars have long been vexed by these questions. Why do the oppressed perpetuate systems that keep them on the margins of power? Is that our next slide, please? I won't go into details here because I assume much of this audience sort of knows these bodies of literature. But these two well-known ethnographies from Muslim feminist studies, are classic, one by Lila Abul Ghad and the other by Sabah Mahmood, who have wrestled with these questions in their own way. Um, but I'd like to, about why women uphold structures of their own oppression, right? Why and how this happens. But I'd like to lift up a question raised by Abul Ghad's later work. Zehra, next slide, please. Which is, what happens when the frameworks of our studies fail to grasp the slippery textures of the lives that we set out to study? What if terms like oppression, choice, and freedom are rather, quote, blunt instruments for capturing the dynamics and quality of lives that we set out to understand? Our feminist frameworks, Leila Abul Ghud argues, inaccurately presume a bounded individual dislocated from the circumstances within which she is constituted, and in which she may remain bound up intimately, often without much choice. In actuality, as Judith Butler writes, individuals are caught up in and formed through, quote, modes of relationality that precede, facilitate, and form any self who comes to know and choose as she or he does. Subjects are formed within interdependencies that exceed their will, and these forms of proximity, of living with, of adjacency and cohabitation that are radically unchosen. Both choosers and the choices they make are contextual, and when formed within interdependent modes of sociality, what one wants, desires, wills, chooses, or what makes us happy is never outside of such attachments. I return often to Uma Narayan's beautiful unpacking old piece, but I just love it so much, of the affective politics in the joint family home in which she grew up. How, Narayan asks, could my loyalty and respect for my culture fail to be tainted by the fact that there was little justice or happiness for my mother in our house? Next slide, please, Anna. Even as her family disregards her feminism as a product of her westernization, Narayan locates the roots of her rebellion in sensing her mother's pain within the home, a pain that surrounded her as a child and that was, quote, earlier than school and westernization, a call to rebellion that has a different and more primary root that was not conceptual or English, but in the mother tongue, end quote. Opening up these complex layerings of oppression within families where we come into being, Narayan beautifully illuminates how some of the fiercest sources of our resistance may in fact be born from the sites where we learn our earliest lessons on how to attach and live in relation to one another. For it is within these messy and contradictory spaces that we often get born as resistors, as feminists who become invested in the project of rewriting cultures that produce us. Framing and enacting resistance in encrusted sites of power involves both risk and strategy, sometimes with very limited outcomes. But to understand, next slide please, resistance merely as a reaction contained within the logic of power, writes Maria Lugones, is to, quote, reduce it in a dangerous way, since reaction does not add anything creative to the meanings of that which is resisted, except some form of no. Resistance is not reaction, but response, thoughtful, often complex, devious, insightful response, insightful into the very intricacies of the structures of what is being resisted, end quote. Next slide, please. It is precisely these issues that are of interest to me, the mechanisms through which we push back against the oppressive institutions that constrain our possibilities of being, even as we navigate the emotional and political contradictions of cultures, of kinship groups, of religious scriptures, the ties that bind us in both loving and oppressive ways. How do these negotiations look in contexts where discourses of individual choice and self empowerment, of just saying no, or cutting the familial debt, or lifting the veil, etc., are less, if not at all, an option? My feminist consciousness was born in these contradictory spaces as well. A big part of the lesson was an incitement for us to become master readers of power and samajdar, or wise, women who learned to creatively strategize and rework some power. These are the scripts we were taught: to understand that unequal and consolidated power is a genuine force, that subjectivity is interdependent, and feminist knowing, or any kind of wisdom, requires operating creatively, contending with, and maneuvering through these genuine forces. These unrelenting stories and cautions, stemming from the gendered contours of their lives, were a source of knowledge that we, the next generation, both internalized, attached to, and fought against vehemently. Even as the elders like Khala worked to stitch us to the gendered rules that constituted Sharafat, they also fostered possibilities for us to debate and even denounce the whole exercise of bargaining with patriarchy. Their fertile stories held context specific instructions on how to live life as women in a patriarchal world. For when a room of one's own is not possible, one must have a contextual strategy for the preservation of a self, always in negotiation with the communities within which we are bound up. I'm approaching the end. Um, I return here to the instructions we got from Khala about the necessity of scanning the mahal, or the environment, in the in-laws' house before letting one's eye loose. For her and women of her generation in our family background, the option of stepping away was not available. The elder women from my father's side were extremely skilled craftswomen. They did Gota and Salma and Sitara work in Bahawalpur and surrounding areas. And they sold their exquisite products for very little money, since earning money in bazaars was the purview of men. Women participated as consumers, and norms of gender segregation perpetuated poverty and dependency and limited mobility. So they worked within the homes. And where the social environment did not allow for formal education for women or men, actually. For us, however, my generation, new urban spatialities eroded older forms of regulation and brought new possibilities. We had access to formal schooling where we mingled with people from different backgrounds. There were more possibilities for securing rishtas, or marriage proposals, at least hypothetically, it seemed that way, beyond the extended family. And our embodiments of modesty had to adjust to the dynamics of urban life. City life, big city life, enabled new subjectivities, and what had to be worked out continuously were the processes of producing and policing appropriately Sharif women. As I conclude, I'd just like to say that as I have built a life living far from my large extended family, my parents have undergone some shift in their knowledge about the possibilities of building a network of interdependence differently. As they reflect back on the lives they built, they too recognize that their lives also built them. As they, like us, continue to grapple with the meanings of happiness, independence, interdependence, freedom, and the boundaries of self within relationalities, they recognize, well, sometimes they do, not always really, that what they learned and knew was not unchangeable or concrete, just as I do about what I know and learn as I build my feminist life. Regulatory structures may have an endurance, but over time, they too morph and become unmoored. Norms within families and communities transform, as do individuals within them, as do cultures that mask as and are represented as permanent, fixed, and unchanging. It is the interdependence of being over time through which we both learn and teach, expand and contract, perhaps somewhat like the pliable eye that Khala tried to teach us about. And herein lies the power of Khala's wisdom. We build ourselves inside interdependent, mobile relations to other people. We become who we are as we change who we are, and as others who depend on us become who they are. And the power is unquestionably unequal. Thank you. I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Professor Sheikh. You spoke so movingly and somehow managed to also rigorously theorize about your own life. And I thought that was really, really impressive and fascinating. So thank you so much. Um, we can move on now to Sreejata Paul. Uh, Hi, Sreejata. Nice to see you there. Will you be sharing a screen possibly, or are you just speaking?
Yeah, let me try to see if I can do this. And then if I can't, maybe you can help me out. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay.
Excellent, great.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
Mhm. Thanks, Zehra. And thanks also to Tasavvur Collective for organizing such a wonderful symposium and for giving me the opportunity to speak today. My presentation is titled Writing Ruqya, For Mothers, Intergenerational Camaraderie and Muslim Women's Biographical Writing in 20th Century Bengal. Most of us know about Ruqya here, have heard about her since yesterday multiple times, but let me just do a brief overview of her life and her contributions, because I'm going to come back to some of this as we progress in the presentation. So Ruqya Sakhawat Hussain was an activist, an educator, a writer. She was the pioneer of Muslim women's education in Bengal, and in fact established the first school aimed at Muslim girls in Calcutta, the Sakhawat Memorial Girls' School, named after her late husband. She also founded the Bengal chapter of the Anjuman-e Khawatine Islam, or the Muslim Women's Association. The original chapter was actually in the United Provinces. It was founded by Sultan Jahan, the Begum of Bhopal. And Ruqya was very inspired by her and decided to found the Bengal chapter. She wrote prolifically for very many periodicals in Bengal at the time. She also wrote fiction. I just provided a small list here. And the images in this slide are sort of to give you a sense of how well known she is in present day Bangladesh and West Bengal. And I'm going to argue that the fact that she is this well known in this cultural world is owing to the writing about Ruqya by two of her younger colleagues. One of them was Shamsun Nahar Mahmud, who brought out the first official biography of Ruqya in 1937. This was titled Ruqya Jivani, or The Life of Ruqya. And the other text that I want to talk about today is Sufia Kamal's memoir, Ekale Amadir Kal, Our Times in These Times, which came out about 50 years later in 1988. So this was a memoir, as I mentioned, a very short one, only 51 pages. But 10 of those 51 pages, so about a fifth of its length, was devoted to Ruqya, her life, her work, her relationship with Kamal, and so on. And I'm going to argue that these two women, Shamsuna Mahmud and Sufia Kamal, They posit Ruqya as a foremother, someone who laid down the blueprint of their lives as writers and as social activists. So just to look closely at the texts themselves, now Ruqya called Shamsun Nahar Mahmud Nahar lovingly, so that's the name I'm going to use for this presentation as well. Nahar's text locates Ruqya within a prehistory of the Muslim women's movement in Bengal, especially in the arena of institutional education. So prior to the establishment of Ruqya's school, Muslim women belonging to the upper echelons of society did have access to private libraries within the space of their homes, usually established by fathers or brothers. And of course, they had access to the Quran. But with the establishment of Ruqya's school, these women left the space of the home and had to go to an institutional setting to learn. And the space was also opened up to women belonging to the lower rungs of society. And of course, because this was an institutional setting, there was a lot of conversation and debate about what was the right kind of thing to wear to school, what was the kind of transport that these girls should be taking to school. So that was something quite different. Nahar, apart from talking about the kind of social work that Ruqya did, also pays attention to her as a writer and translator. And she says that Ruqya never imitated anyone in her writing. She drew from her own painful experiences of being widowed at a young age, of running a school when she had never, in fact, attended a school. And so the challenges that came with that. And this is not very well known outside of Nahar's writing about Ruqya, but Ruqya also translated the Victorian writer Mary Corelli's novel, Murder of Delicia, to show her readers that British women were often not very much better off than their counterparts in the subcontinent. Nahar also in her text quotes quite liberally from Ruqya's own writing, especially from this text that I mentioned in an earlier slide, Oborod Vashini, which came out in 1931 and has been translated as The Secluded Ones. But this is a very passionate indictment of the excesses of parda. And Nahar quotes large sections of the text to show Ruqya's use of wit, humor, and irony. What Nahar also does is she identifies Ruqya's own foremothers, the women that she learned from, was inspired by. And this included her sister Karim-un-Nessa, who was a poet, but we don't have access to her texts because she was never published. But Karim-un-Nessa is the one who taught Ruqya to read and write in Bangla. And when she married Sakhawat Hussain, he was a native of Bihar and Bangla was not spoken at home. But Karim-un-Nessa made sure to still write to her in Bangla so that she stays in touch with the language. And this is very important because most of Ruqya's writing that survives and has come down to us is in Bangla. Then Nahar also mentions Sultan Jahan, the Begum of Bhopal, who, as I mentioned, Ruqya was associated with through the Anjuman-e-Khawateen-e-Islam. There was Lady Kempsford, wife of colonial official who donated quite generously to Ruqya's school, often attended events such as school, often was the chief guest at these events as well. And then finally, Sarojini Naidu, who at this time was the editor of the Indian Ladies magazine, which is where Ruqya's most famous work, her only work originally written in English, Sultana's Dream, appeared in 1905. Now, Nahar's text is largely formal in tone, quite decorous, but sometimes also hyperbolic and proselytic. And just to give you an example of that kind of hyperbole, at one point in the text, Nahar compares Ruqya's school to the Taj Mahal, and therefore, by a curious kind of gender reversal, Ruqya is to her comparable to Shah Jahan and her husband to Mumtaz Mahal, for whom the Taj Mahal was built. But what Nahar is trying to do, I think, is outline a model of companionate marriage that she sees between Ruqya and her husband. And remember, this text appears in the 1930s. And so it's very much a text of its own time. And so Nahar is making a point about how Ruqya's husband encouraged her to write, supported her education, saved money so she could start her school. And then Ruqya in turn looks after him in his last days. He was diabetic and died from that. Nahar barely ever inserts herself in the narrative. And the only exception is she recalls this time that Ruqya organized a meeting to celebrate her having passed the Bachelor of Arts examination. And at this meeting, Ruqya says 32 years ago, she had dreamt of and written about lady magistrates and lady barristers. And that dream might finally be coming true through women like Nahar. Sorry, I'm trying to get to the, yeah, there we go. Kamal's text, unlike Nahar's, was not formal. It was quite anecdotal. And her own relationship with Ruqya forms the crux of the narrative. So Kamal talks about how Ruqya was family, even though they weren't related. How Ruqya lovingly called her Fool Kubi, or flower poet. And at one point in the narrative, she says, my tears are welling up as I recall how Ruqya often told me that even though I never went to school, I could still contribute meaningfully to society through my poetry. And so this is what encouraged Kamal to start writing and then keep writing. Ruqya's fiction also features quite prominently in Kamal's telling of her life. So Kamal says, if you want to know what Ruqya's school was like, you'd have to read her novel Padmarag, which appeared in 1924, was translated as Ruby. Kamal says that Ruqya's school was like Tarini Bhavan. This is a charitable institution that was the setting of Padmarag. And she says that if you looked at the characters in Padmarag, you could see they were really people that populated Ruqya's school. So that she's trying to really give you a glimpse into how reality and fiction coalesce in Ruqya's writing. And she has the luxury of doing this because her text appears in the 1980s. She already has a sense of how Ruqya is starting to be reclaimed, and she's plugging into that. And isn't burdened with the kind of responsibility that Nahar's text was burdened with in the 1930s of establishing a reputation for Ruqya. Ruqya already has a reputation by this time, and Kamal is contributing to that quite consciously. And so she also talks about attempts to memorialize Ruqya outside of writing. She talks about how she founded the Begum Ruqya Smriti Committee, the Begum Ruqya Memorial Committee. And she picked up this brick from the ruins of Ruqya's childhood home and placed it in a prominent place in the village where Ruqya was born to give people a sense of how someone from such humble beginnings went on to achieve as much as Ruqya did. Now, if you were to place Nahar's text and Kamal's text next to each other and read them together, what emerges is a picture of Ruqya that's not very well known outside of the kind of women's studies scholarship that has reclaimed her in the past 30, 40 years. You may even come across snippets of information that body of scholarship does not take cognizance of. Nahar and Kamal, for instance, write of Ruqya's passion for travel and her belief that travel and learning were intimately intertwined, how she traveled with her husband, with female friends, and in these travels always tried to learn from nature because she believed that if you didn't travel, you would be a kupomunduk, a frog in a well that didn't know there was a world outside of the well as well. So Ruqya's belief in the pedagogical qualities of travel. Nahar and Kamal also both describe Ruqya's intellectual networks, the women that she interacted with on a regular basis. And this included administrators of girls' schools other than her own in Calcutta, because like I said, she had never been to school. She never attended school, and yet she had to run a school. And so these were the women who showed her the ropes. She was also a member of the All India Women's Association, as was Sarojini Naidu. Nahar's text does this interesting thing. It reproduces letters that Rokeya had written to family and friends over the years, and which they happen to have preserved. And one of these letters mentions how Rokeya was invited by the Aligarh Mahila Samiti, the Aligarh Women's Association, to visit Aligarh in 1926 and talk about setting up a women's college there on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the Aligarh Muslim University. And of course, Nahar and Kamal also write about the Anjuman-e-Khawatine-e-Islam. They were both members, and this is where they met and worked alongside Rokeya. And they both talk about Rokeya's encouragement and support of a younger generation of authors and activists like themselves. The one point which Nahar and Kamal seem to disagree on, Nahar seems to believe that, and she says this, that Rokeya is a far greater writer than she is a social activist or social worker. And Kamal is of the opinion that the work she did for Muslim girls, school-going girls, and Dalits far surpasses what her writing was able to achieve.
Sreejata, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Just letting you know that you have 1 minute to wrap up. Just that. Please go on.
That's perfect. That's perfect. This is my last slide. So I just wanted to end with something that Kamal gestures towards in her text, and that really is the motivation behind this presentation and perhaps a larger project. She writes about how Nahar has immortalized Rokeya through her biography, and how Nahar in turn has been immortalized by Mushraka Mahmood, who has written a biography of Nahar. And so Kamal is here gesturing towards a chain of Muslim women as biographers, and gesturing towards how Muslim women are keeping each other's legacies alive. And I thought that was a fascinating idea, and I just wanted to see what I could do with it. I'll stop here. Thanks so much for listening, and I welcome any questions or comments that you may have.
That's a fascinating paper, Sreejata, and I really enjoyed it. I happen to know, have a close friend here in St. Andrews who works on feminist genealogy, but in Italian literature, and I could see so many resonances with her. So I was literally, while you were speaking, messaging her, being like, you know, someone is doing feminist genealogy, but in this context as well, and she was very excited. But no, outside, this was a fascinating paper, and really interesting network of or sort of generational solidarity that speaks quite well in some ways to what Professor Shaikh had also kind of touched upon in her presentation. Next, we have Pranay Sood, who will be presenting on the anxieties of memory, caste, and Ashrafia in Iqbal Majid's Namak. Pranay, can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
Hi, am I audible?
Hi. Yes, there's just a little bit of disturbance. Can you just speak again?
Am I audible now?
Something happens with your mic when you speak, I believe.
Is this better?
I think it's fine. It's just that when you finish, there's like this bzzz noise afterwards. So when you finish a sentence.
All right. Maybe some sort of technical glitch. I apologize for that.
Maybe you could remove the headphones and then speak if that's maybe or will that be a problem?
Okay, I can do that, but I'll have to switch off the fan because that might cause some interruption.
Yeah, I think it's the fan probably.
Right. Just give me a second.
Sure. Yeah, classic South Asia problem is it's too hot in a Zoom presentation, and you need to keep the fan on, but no one can hear you over the fan. And I feel like this is a specific Zoom quirk that I suppose academics in South Asia have to face. Yeah, go ahead, please,
Right.
Pranay.
Is this somewhat better now?
Yes, this is much better. We don't have the flashback that was happening. Great, great.
Right,
Thanks,
all right.
Pranay.
So I will not be sharing my screen. I'll be just reading my paper if that's all right with you.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. I can start timing you whenever.
Right, okay, so I'm starting now. So the paper is called Anxieties of Memory, Cast in Ashrafia and Iqbal Majid's Namak. I should tell you that this was a longer paper, so I had to cut it short. So if the flow of the paper seems a bit jarring, I apologize for that. So here's the paper. Of the many changes that came to pass in colonial North India as a result of the failure of revolt of 1857, one with particular importance and far-reaching significance was the radical transformation in ideas of respectability and nobility. Because of having participated in the revolt, the Mughals, and by extension the Muslims, were left particularly vulnerable. As Khoja Mulji has noted, dispossessed of power and targeted by the existing regime, Muslim intelligentsia realized that for them, the one way to ensure their survival and betterment was to fit into the new social, administrative, and judicial order that was introduced by the British. These changes initiated the alignment of Muslim intellectual and social life with British norms of acceptability and propriety under the leadership of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. This resulted in the formation of a class of Western educated, English speaking, and upwardly mobile individuals who answered his call and laid great emphasis on conforming to British ideas of respectability and social order. This paper shall explore the far-reaching and still lingering effects of these changes on questions of gender, social imaginaries of acceptable womanhood, and the resultant complexity of dynamics and intersections between respectability and sharafat, by looking at the portrayal of the character of Zohra, a former Tawayaf, in Iqbal Majid's novel Namak. The primary thrust of the argument would be to exhibit how discourses about the Tawayaf shifted substantially owing to Oriental sociology in British India, and how these changes are echoed in the treatment meted out to Zohra by her son and grandson. Any historical association with the Tawayaf Zohra have been shown to be shunned and obliterated from public memory by Zohra's son and grandson in order to forge and consolidate an ashraf position for themselves and their family in independent India. This is done through the creation of a narrative identity. Through an exploration of the intersection between caste, sexuality, and narrative identity, we shall reach a comprehensive understanding of how Majid's book allows readers to probe the long-reaching implications of discursive formulations of colonial sexuality. Iqbal Majid's Namak considers the narrative unfolding of Zohra's life and its eventual obfuscation and termination through the eyes of her maternal granddaughters, Simsim and Istam. For most part of the novel, Zohra is confined to room number 1 of Darul Istiqbar, which is ancestral home to many generations of the family. Zohra is 92 and Simsim, a journalism student, tries to know about the history of her family for a college project by engaging in multiple conversations with Zohra throughout the length of the novel. Thus, major sections of the book, major sections of the work evolve in front of the reader as reminiscences narrated to Simsim by Zohra. In the opening pages, we are presented with the process that led to Zohra being confined to room number 1. Majid writes, Zohra Khanum is 92. When she was 60 and had spread her fame far and wide, her grandson cleared the civil services examination, and in order to preserve the name and dignity of the family and wipe her off of public memory, confined her to room number 1 of Darul Istiqbar. She has lived there for the past 32 years. And, as Istam notes, Zohra Khanum, alias Mehboob Jan of Atrolia, is my grandmother. I cannot feed this into my computer's memory because soon after independence, my father exhausted all efforts and successfully became a part of a few bourgeois circles and was successful in securing the managing directorship of a trading firm for himself. Soon, he cast off his old clothes, brought himself a new pair from the marketplace, and declared himself and the family a part of the Ashrafia. The interplay between memory and Ashraf identity. The interplay between memory, Ashraf identity, and Zohra's past as a courtesan with ties to feudal Awadh culture is worth noting here. The male members of her family are keen on protecting their good name and privileged social position as Ashrafs from being sullied by obliterating any associations with the Tawayaf. Significantly, it is not mere acquisition of wealth and money that allows one to be perceived as a part of the Ashrafs. It has also to come with certain prerequisites like social acceptability and sanction. It is this peculiar trait of caste within Indian Muslims that allows one to switch from lower Ajlaf or Arzal categories to the higher Ashraf. As Parvez Nazir has noted, there is an important distinction between caste and its concomitant practices in Hindu and Muslim societies. Nazir emphasizes that in South Asian Muslim societies, while something resembling the Hindu caste system has been practiced, the boundaries between the Ashraf, Ajlaf, and Arzal groups are not as strict as they are between the Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra groups in Hindu caste structures. Traditionally, the Ashraf are considered to be descendants of Arabs, Turks, Persians, Pathans, and local Brahmin converts to Islam. Ajlaf constitute people with lower status like village artisans, and Arzal are the ones engaged in menial labor like cleaning and leather work. Mines notes something similar. He says that the respective caste positions are ascertained in the act of command. That is, those who can command ritual and economic services are higher than the ones who offer those services. However, both note that these distinctions are not watertight and that caste in Muslims is an aspirational category rather than a monolithic one. And therefore, there is a distinct possibility for people to actually switch from one caste position to another. Zohra's confinement to room number 1 of Darul Istiqbar and its relation with the family moving up the caste ladder to claim Ashraf position becomes evident and plain in the context of the preceding discussion. While Zohra was once a renowned courtesan and had Nawabs visit her, in independent India, her presence has become a marker of humiliation and ignominy for the present generation of males in the family. It is the possibility of being found out to be descendants of a Tawayaf and resultant shame at the connotations of sexual and moral depravity and uncleanliness, which results in Zohra being confined. Based on the preceding discussion, we can begin to unpack deliberate constructions of favorable and socially valuable identities in Namak. Zohra, as a former courtesan, brings shame with her morally degenerate selfhood, which is seen to be at odds with the newly found wealth and social prestige that comes with being a highly placed government official and businessman. There is, therefore, the resultant need to eliminate any past associations that would cause shamefulness to be ascribed to such an upwardly mobile family. Hence, Zohra is confined and there is an attempt to annihilate her memory from public domain. Two strains of argument then acquire importance. The first is the discourses grounded in legal and medical sciences that led to the Tawayaf becoming an ignoble character. And second, the narrative construction of self-identity by supplanting public memory with new images and symbols that elicit respectability. In recent scholarship, much has been written about the discursive construction of sexuality in British India and its relations with Tawayaf. Oldenburg and Sengupta have highlighted the tendency in British administration to pin blame on the depraved Nautch girls and prostitutes for the exponential rise of venereal diseases among British soldiers. It was observed by the British that in the mutiny of 1857, many of their soldiers died not because of injury and wounds sustained during battle conditions, but because of contracting diseases of the genitalia, and the Tawayafs were considered to be the source of this pollution of the body, a signifier of their inherent pollution and depravity. This was radically different from the privileged positions enjoyed by the Tawayafs among the Mughal and Nawabi elite in noble culture. Originally, the Tawayafs sustained the morals, manners, and distinctiveness of high culture, provided patronage to classical musicians and dance tutors, and were versed in those art forms themselves. Additionally, they were highly literate and were frequently poets and or connoisseurs of high literature in Urdu and Persian. Their establishments were frequented by the political and business elite, and children, particularly men from their household, were sent to Tawayafs to learn the rules of adab. Oldenburg notes that Oldenburg notes that following the usurpation of Kingdom of Awadh and the subsequent end of Mughal rule in 1857, traditional patronage for Tawayafs ended. Additionally, they were also at the receiving end of the wrath of British administration for having aided the mutiny and supporting the Nawabs. Their participation in the mutiny and the spread of diseases among British soldiers were together employed by the British to mount a restrictive and regimental control on the bodies of these women. Philippa Levine makes the vital observation that such stern and uncompromising categorization and control of the Tawayaf's body resulted from the colonizers' need to understand the colonial milieu and its subjects from within the framework of classifications that already existed within the ambit of their knowledge. This selective and incomplete information was delivered and used as objective knowledge. The manufacturers of colonial knowledge found it difficult to define and ascertain what would count as prostitution and which acts could thus fall in this rubric. Levine insists that In the popular British imagination, no significant difference existed between a common prostitute and a tawayaf. They were both sex workers, and the general social acceptance accorded to the prostitute caste was emblematic of Oriental degradation. Levine also quotes the divisional commissioner of the Kumon in northwestern provinces, who claimed that the class of women who in India resort to prostitution is mainly composed of the persons of the caste of Paturya or prostitute. The above discussion reveals that courtesans and prostitutes began to be looked as members of a particular caste, and that this caste occupied the lower rungs of society and was thus to be looked down upon. As has been made amply clear, colonial ethnosociology contributed to this articulation, and the upwardly mobile new Ashraf social groups that rose to prominence after Mughal and Nawabi nobility faded in wake of the failure of the revolt increasingly subscribed to British notions of acceptability and prestige. These new Ashraf groups consisted of scholars, educators, businessmen, and landowning gentry. Additionally, norms of Sharafat changed too. One's distinctiveness no longer came from being a part of the aristocracy, but by being a hardworking, educated, pious, and self-disciplined individual who would keep his affairs in order and attain marital blissfulness. Zohra, being a former Tawayef, presents the male members of her family with a peculiar predicament. It becomes imperative for people as Sharif as the two men in question pair, a businessman and a civil servant, to project a sanitized image of the self and therefore manufacture a past that fits neatly with their present narrative construction of self-identity. In the novel, this is done by supplanting Zohra's lived history and its memories with fabricated versions of Sharif lineage in order to foreground a favorable image in public space. Zohra's life emerges in moments of recollection narrated to her granddaughters. Equally crucial is the fact that in the process of narrating her history, Zohra becomes a narrative herself. Her experiences as a young courtesan, Mehboob Jan, the tussles with her husband, her heyday and eventual decline, ending in confinement, are abstracted and take up the nature of commodities to be recorded, preserved, and dissected. Zohra's lived experience becomes an artifact from the past that should be looked at not as something objective, signifying a static set of meanings, but rather as a constantly shifting and volatile agglomerate that can be taken to mean different things depending on where the viewer looks at it from. Stories, memories, and narratives thus acquire nature of artifacts, and culture can be read through them. Zohra gradually comes to be seen not as a human being, but as a site where intergenerational memory manifests itself. Simpson's description of Zohra makes her seem an intellectual curiosity more than anything else. This is also conveyed in Simpson's description of her as a lost document finally retrieved and opened for reading and interpretation. This is the outlook of her that her professor has encouraged her to adopt. Majid notes. The professor had urged her to recreate her grandmother. He had mentioned that all stories are unique in their own way, embedded with their own logic and prejudices. For him, this is how media and communication students understood how to unpack and decipher their own identities. Zohra's identity is a repository of meaning, and it then becomes important to control the meanings that can be extracted out of her. It is therefore important to remove the Zohra that we come to know through Zohra's own recollections and replace her with a lifeless, monolithic signifier that would project an acceptable and unblemished image of the family, of family history, which would be acceptable by the society at large and also help the family to sustain the narrative of their Ashraf identity. The real
Just
Zohra that,
interrupting to say you have 2 more minutes, Pranay. That's all.
right. The real Zohra that Simpson and Islam talk to and who talks back in order to facilitate contributions to her narrative identity is simply eliminated. In her stead is placed a portrait of Zohra in the outside hall, dressed as a noble Ashraf woman, complete with rosary and books. Her son then manufactures a narrative about her being a social reformer, no longer alive. Zohra's son seeks a unified narrative identity, and therefore the past must be carefully recalibrated and reconstituted for there to be a continuity in his narrative conception of himself and to bolster his social standing. Douglas Ezzy opines that an individual constitutes himself through narrative and is resultantly a self-narrating organism. In order for these narrations to stand true, it is important for individuals to remove any aberrations that would lead to their narrations being discredited, and thereby emerges the need to maintain what is called concordance between the past, present, and the future. Concordance is defined as a form of self-sameness that temporarily unifies identity. It is vital to note here the role of forgetfulness in memory studies. Thane emphasizes that all memories are selective and thus intertwined with them inevitably is amnesia. And it is this sort of amnesia that Zohra's son and Zohra's grandson try to inculcate in public memory. Majid presents a stark contrast with great acumen, where public memory is controlled and designed by the males of the household, and personal memories are depicted to be the preserve of women in the book. The divisions of public and private memory are also divisions of public and private spaces. Therefore, while public memory is imposed in the form of larger than life painting that is immutable, personal memory in the novella unfolds not as a monolithic whole, but in the form of oral history between Zohra, Simsim, and Islam. Public memory remains the prerogative of the males, while private and internal memories are neglected and remain unnoticed in this gendered separation of memory. That was the reason for the development of oral history studies. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pranay. Some really good close reading and theoretical work that you've managed to combine in your analysis of this book, and I'm really excited to read the novel as well because I've not read this one. So thanks for that. We can now move on to Professor Afroz Taj, who is joining us all the way from the States. So thank you so much, Professor. Um, uh, I'm happy. Oh, you're screen sharing, so that's good. Um, we can start whenever you're ready.
Okay, I'm ready. And thank you very much. Thank you, Zehra and the Tasavvur Collective for the opportunity to join you in this wonderful conference. As the global pulp fiction wave spread through South Asia in the early 20th century, a significant number of women entered the market as writers of Urdu novels. Writers like A.R. Khatun, Razia Bhatt were ready widely in both India and Pakistan by generations of readers. In contrast to progressive writers like Ismat Chughtai and Khatija Mastoor, the women pulp novelists wrote for a middle-class readership that was still solidly bound by traditional notions of women's agency and subjectivity. These writers, however, created innovative heroines that were modern, educated, and socially liberal, but who embodied a modernity that was contrasted with colonial and post-colonial westernization. In this presentation, I'll combine evidence from my own childhood experiences in Uttar Pradesh, India, and the materials and textual evidences of the novels themselves to develop an archaeology of the Urdu romance novel phenomenon. I also trace how these novels found new audiences with the advent of Pakistani television dramas. I argue that Urdu novels and television dramas written by and for and for women are an important site for the ongoing negotiation of Muslim modernity in South Asia. I would like to begin by dedicating this presentation to my mom, my mother, Anwar Bano Rizvi. I call her Ammi Jan, who was the embodiment of Indian Muslim modernity in her all too brief life. She gave birth to 10 children and hunted from the back of her white mare, Bark. That was her name, the mare's name, and wrote ghazals and nohe. She never missed a prayer and never missed a movie. Ammijan was an avid reader of novels, and her reading played an essential role in her worldview and her understanding of society beyond Kasganj, the medium sized, I would call small sized town where we lived. Like many neighborhoods in India in the 1960s, Our neighborhood housed a women's reading network. Ammi Jaan and her friends and neighbors would pass new novels and magazines issues from hand to hand. When Ammi Jaan would get together with her friends, the latest novel were likely to be the topic of discussion, although new films were also a hot topic. A note here that many film screenplays were based on these very same novels that Ammi Jaan had been reading. And there was a deep relationship between popular literature and the Hindi Urdu cinema. Now, a similar relationship exists between novels and Pakistani TV dramas. I will return to this point later on. Ammi Jan's favorite writer was A.R. Khatun. Her full name was Ummatur Rahman Khatun, was born in Delhi around 1900. In addition to writing novels, she wrote children's stories and number of articles in the Urdu journal, which called Ismat. After her death in 1965, several of her novels were adopted as Pakistani TV dramas. Although her novels do not follow a repetitive formula, they usually concern a young heroine who faces a series of challenges relating to family, politics, and marriage. The heroine would overcome these challenges with a combination of wit and courage, while strictly following social codes and morality, and walking the fine line between modernity and morality, or I would call modernity and tradition. By the time I left home for college, Ammi Jaan had acquired a large personal collection of novels. In this presentation, I follow the lead of Paula Rabinowitz. Paula Rabinowitz wrote the article, the book, 2014 book, American Pulp, How Paperbacks Brought Modernism to Main Street. Rabinowitz traces how her mother's collection of pulp paper novels inspired her academically in career. Likewise, it was Ammi Jaan's love of popular literature that inspired me to undertake this project. There were different difficulties, however, because pulp fiction was not considered literature. It was not collected by academic libraries or included in archives. Like most private collections, my mother's collection was sold to Raddiwala or used paper or scrap papers dealers long ago. One day, about 10 or 15 years ago, I bought roasted chickpeas from a street vendor in India, and I was surprised to see that the packaging was a page torn from some fascinating Urdu novel, now lost forever. It was that experience that moved me to start the project of tracking down old novels in the hopes not only of reconstructing my mother's collection, but also recapturing this lost body of work from the mid-20th century. In some senses, these women's novels are part of the subaltern archive. I started my search in used books around India and Pakistan. In India, most booksellers declared that Urdu was long gone, long dead, and offered me books on how to crack the GMAT or TOEFL or SAT or GRE. In Urdu centers like Hyderabad, Lucknow, Lahore, and Delhi, Urdu is still alive and well, but the books for sale were books on Islam, or how to grow hair, or lighten skin, or what happens after death, etc. These kind of issues were being sold. I also became a regular shopper at South Asia's Itwar Bazaar and the Sunday Street flea market. where I spend hours in the hot sun on the streets of Daryaganj, Delhi, Anarkali, Lahore, and Murgi Chowk in Hyderabad, sorting through piles and books and magazines, racking of dust, mildew, and bookworms. A few years ago, I found a treasure of old Urdu novels in a strange place, in a pigeon coop on the roof of a house in a Nakhas, Lucknow. They had been stored, or I would call dumped, there when the owner's lending library was converted to a store selling locally made American jeans. I was particularly looking for a book by A.R. Khatun one day. All the books I found some I was still looking for by A.R. Khatun. One day I was in a Lucknow bookstore claiming to have old books on its sign. I asked the seller for old novels. He said, "We don't sell these useless bakwas books anymore. We sell only the religious books," he replied, and tried to send me off like a beggar on the excuse that he was getting late for namaz, which is prayer. But I caught sight of a few old books on an upper shelf. The shopkeeper climbed up rickety ladder and muttering, "There is no book like this, and they are all religious books." Then suddenly, as if heaven sent, as if heaven sent, a dusty old book fell down from the top shelf. I picked it up and recognized it is Chashma by A.R. Khatun, a novel I had been looking for a long time. Next, I will talk briefly about what makes Urdu popular novels unique. First, Urdu writing is historically associated with progressive politics, while in Hindi, commercial fiction remains more aligned with conservative nationalism, and this divide has been wider in recent years. In Pakistan too, Urdu novels and dramas lean towards the socially progressive side, exploring topics like domestic violence, divorce, and sexuality, even while openly critiquing westernization. Second, even though women's novels are usually assigned to the domestic sphere, this is not completely true for Urdu novels in the 1960s and 70s. As more women found success publishing novels and poetry, more women were encouraged to write and submit their work for publication, thus bringing them into the public sphere. Many women Urdu novelists were career housewives as well as writers. It is difficult to find biographical details about these writers, precisely because they were literally working from home. Third, Urdu women novelists also did not necessarily stay within the boundaries of the romance genre. Indeed, because of South Asian social taboos on romance, the term romance novel is not quite appropriate. Women's novels concern family intrigues and politics, interesting with a marriage discussion, the politics intersecting with marriage discussions, thus overlapping to some extent with the detective genre. Even as I lament the loss of the print archive, I'm aware that Urdu women's novels as a genre has not disappeared. It gained new life due to two parallel trends, Pakistani television dramas and Urdu digests. In 1976, the Pakistani television drama Shama was produced based on the classic 1929 novel by A.R. Khatun. The opening credits of Shama show a stack of novels, the uppermost novel being Shama, with the author's name A.R. Khatun clearly visible on the cover. Shama, the title character, is a young woman who is orphaned and must fend for herself. She is surrounded by a people who want to steal her inheritance, either by forcing her into marriage or kidnapping her. The TV adaptation was written by Fatma Suraya Wajia, who would go on to become one of the most influential people in Pakistani television. 1976 is
Just
also the
interrupting,
year.
sorry, Professor Taj, just interrupting to say that we have 1 minute left. Obviously, I'm happy to give you another extra minute to wrap up if you'd like 2 more minutes or 3 more minutes.
Great, wonderful. Thank you very much. In 1976 is also a year when Umaira Ahmed was born. Umaira Ahmed is one of the leading Urdu novelists in Pakistan today, and many of her novels have been adopted for television, most notably Zindagi Gulzar Hai aur Teri Zaat Zarra Bin Isham, etc. Likewise, several novels of Razia Bhatt have been recreated as television dramas. The most popular of these was the 2010 Hum TV production Dastan, an adaptation of Razia Bhatt's novel Bano. Set in the time of partition, Dastan follows the trails of heroine Bano as she tries to escape India and get to the new nation of Pakistan. But both the novel and the drama critique Pakistan as not living up to the ideas of its founders. A.R. Khatun's novel Hala is likewise set during partition. I should mention here that Pakistani TV dramas are not only watched by women and not only watched in Pakistan, they have always been watched in India as well as all over South Asia. First, through cross-border television broadcast and pirated videos, and then through cable and dish channels like Zee Zindagi, which showed Dastan and Zindagi Gulzar Hai to enthusiastic Indian audiences. Now, many of my Indian friends, both in India and the diaspora, binge watch Pakistani drama on YouTube and other OTT platforms. So this is the conclusion. Since independence in both India and Pakistan, Urdu as a reader's language has been endangered in many ways. This has been partly due to national policies in India and the double onslaught of English and digital globalization in both countries. I argue, however, that Urdu popular fiction, especially that written by women for women, has played a crucial role in keeping Urdu alive as a written and spoken language more so than highbrow literature. By appealing to popular tastes, Urdu women's novels and dramas have lured audiences to Urdu literature. I believe that writers like Qurratul Ain Haider and Ismat Choghtai would not have the readership they currently enjoy if not for writers like Razia Bhatt and or A.R. Khatun. And furthermore, as we have seen, Urdu novels and television's dramas continue to provide a space where issues of Muslim modernity are discussed and negotiated. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Doctor. Oh, perfect, great. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Dr. Taj. Especially love that little anecdote about your mother about reminded me of so many women in my own family as well. So thank you. That was
Thank
wonderful.
you very much.
We will now move on to our last speaker for the day, Fizza Joffrey. And I think, Sheila, if you could stop recording, possibly